Okay, good afternoon, good morning, whenever. Welcome to the Tondup Tang University course video for Sociology of Popular Culture. I'm John Hutnick, and I'm going to talk today about the context of the colonial foundations of pop culture. I've got some slides, well, they're already showing one of them, to help, and some bits of video, and I might play the guitar as well. What I'm going to talk about really is I don't know why it's not working. Hang on. Yeah. Popular culture in the 60s. I know that was like 60 years ago and more, the late 60s especially. And these bands, the Stones and the Beatles, especially in the middle to late 60s, when they got interested in, and the whole of youth culture became quite interested in peace and anti-war, for reasons that will become obvious as part of the context. And I guess they turned to Asia. And the Beatles and the Stones especially turned to the musical world of India. And I want to say that they did it in a way that was somewhat exoticist or Orientalist. There's readings we can do about that, which I'll suggest. And that the analysis of this is fairly standard now, accepted, that they had a fantasy version of India. They were trying to get away from Western bourgeois market world and so on, that they obviously had profited greatly from, and change their mind and get into another way of looking at the world. And they thought that they would find it in the mysticism or magical spiritualism of Asia, especially to do with Hinduism and the colours and sounds of what was an exotic world for them, for these lads from Richmond in London or from Liverpool in the north of England. So, yeah, exotica and Orientalism. And I want to make a critique of that in terms of how the culture industry actually ended up turning this search for alternatives to Western market bourgeois life into yet another way of selling product, this time Asian influenced or inflected product, the sounds of Asia, as commodity back in that market system, the world market system. Okay, so that's why it's popular culture and popular music's political context. Selling records, basically commodities. And we're going to explore that. And yeah, the next slide is very slowly. A picture of, well, this is Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones with which instrument? You should guess, a sitar. And the sound you'll hear in the background is the drone of a sitar or tempura, which is the base of classical Indian sitar music or classical music. This drone sound that runs underneath. It's highly recognizable. I'm sure you've heard this before, and which, yeah, kind of challenged the normal formulas of a 3-minute pop song. It went on continuously and led to all sorts of misunderstandings, let's say, interpretations, and was part of the fantasy of difference in exotica. And getting this sort of sound in a pop context was difficult unless you were a musical virtuoso like Brian Jones, or the Beatles were experimenting with lots of other instruments as well, and any alternative, right? Here's color, and so this is from Yellow Submarine. I'm not going to play the trailer because it doesn't record well. I might be able to play some of it. Let me try.
Nothing is real. The Beatles. Yellow Submarine. photography, landscapes painted with Beatles sound.
There's a lot of sound there you can hear in the Yellow Submarine trailer, which is derived from sitar music. You see in the pictures here, we've got on one side the picture of two people is George Harrison with Ravi Shankar, and again on the other side it's Brian Jones again. And the track I'm going to start playing is "Painted Black" from the Rolling Stones, and Ravi Shankar is known to have once quipped, whether it was about what George Harrison was doing on the sitar or commenting on Brian Jones, I don't know. He is very surprised that they could get those kind of sounds out of a sitar, but certainly it was very different to his trained, deeply profound knowledge of the instrument, and these guys just picked up any old instrument and learned to play them in a matter of weeks and included them on their latest pop offerings. But it is interesting to see what the track "Painted Black" does with the sound, because I'm going to have to show you. I don't have a sitar here, but I want to show you how the sound of classical music, that drone sound we were listening to before, and the sound of the sitar, its lyric, melodic sounds as well, were transposed into guitar. Let me try and show this. Right? Okay. I have to change cameras so we can pick up the sound. So what I'm going to try and do is play this on the guitar to show you how a song that was recorded, composed on the sitar by Brian Jones is then transposed onto this instrument. Now, it's the case that the guitar doesn't have the same kind of drone sound as the tempura or sitar, right? You play a note like the E note on a guitar and it fades out. All right. So to replace that, what they did was standard pop song thing is the rhythm track, the backing track, which is kind of bassy, and they made a kind of drone out of that, which goes something like, right? I mean, it's a rhythm. It has that kind of same intonation, I suppose, and then over the top, the lyric part of the sitar, the lyric line, the melody line runs, which goes something like. Okay, so the two of them together. Sing. Let's listen to someone who can do it well. Keith Richards doing it live. I guess what I want us to think about from Painted Black is the way in which, there are kind of two sides to the world of popular culture. One, a search to go elsewhere to find, an alternative to Western market system, and the other, a kind of commercial repackaging of Asia for the commodity system itself. And there was another side that's kind of erased in the memory, that if we remember the 60s as only the Beatles versus the Stones, is the importance of other political contexts. And I want to get at this by thinking about the theorist, the number one theorist for thinking about popular culture, which is the theorist behind and the idea behind the whole purpose of this course is to think about Adorno's work, Theodore Adorno. And he has some various things to say about Vietnam itself, but I wonder what he would study if he came to Vietnam today. How he would have studied the situation in the 60s as he did. I mean, what would he make of late 60s turn in popular culture towards Asia, since he was already controversial for what he had to say about jazz, and I think much misunderstood. Let me spend a couple of minutes talking about this, because on jazz, right, he's so allegedly against jazz and so on. But his point was that popular culture was being used to express ideological positions. And so on jazz, he says various things. He wrote the essay on jazz, Über Jazz, which is very critical of jazz, as under a false name in the 1930s when Hitler's Nazis were coming to power. And he wrote it under the name of Hector Rottweiler, which should be a clue, right? Hectoring. Hector means to hassle, to shout at. Rottweiler, a kind of attack dog. So he was talking about jazz, but really I think he was talking about Nazi marching music. So he asks what is meant by jazz, and that raises many answers and much discussion. But he wasn't paying attention as much to what jazz was as thinking about what it was used for, and it was used as a kind of tool to beat down the opposition of black music, to say this was degenerate black music, but also it was in big band jazz, popular among the Nazis, a kind of version of marching music and a mass commodity ideal for fascism. So, there much sense in thinking about Adorno's critique of jazz as being really about something else, about a critique of fascism. And so it's interesting if he talks about improvisation, which revolts against collective power by being individual. That's not a revolt that can mobilize collective power. It's a revolt of anger, and is beaten down by the drum of syncopation. Maybe that makes sense to think about the rhythms, the drone effect that was imported into pop culture in the 60s by the Happy Clappy Beatles and by the Stones in Painted Black. There's two sides of what was they're beating down by the syncopation of the beat. Because what is missing is what Adorno did talk about in Vietnam, some of the other political dimensions. So what was happening when the Beatles went off to India? What did they do and go and see? Well, if we think about Adorno and his closely allied thinker Benjamin, we will have to think about the culture industry and product. And the Beatles went to consume, I guess, a product which was exotic India, the colourful, the mystical, and the magical. So the Beatles went to India on a magical, mystical tour, on a magical bus, I suppose. They only went for a couple of weeks, but still. They stayed in an ashram with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who's the gentleman you see in the middle here, learning techniques of meditation and yoga and reading the Bhagavad Gita, I suppose. Here we've got John, Paul, George, I think that's Paddy, and I don't know who the other person is. It's not Stu. And they're with Mahesh Yogi, who became famous for transcendental meditation, which was kind of yoga packaged for the Western market. I mean, he was already making a marketing ploy, no doubt, by contracting the Beatles to come to his ashram. But nevertheless, it made yoga, cashed in on yoga in the West. It was a very important intervention, I guess, in some ways in popular culture, that the Beatles even went to India at a time when Britain was quite a racist place, and there was problems with immigration, people feeling threatened by not white immigrants coming to to save the economy basically after World War II, but portrayed by some politicians as stealing jobs. Their racism was quite deep, and so any appearance from these, I guess we might call them influencers today, the Beatles, to be interested in India was a bit of a pushback against that racism, although, as I say, it was kind of exotica. And in the end, what the Beatles were about was selling, they were part of a system, selling product to youth of the day, and clothing lines and kind of small scale commodity system in alternative clothes was soon to blow up to be really huge, and in fact whole parts of the American urban landscape were changed in look, like the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, people with flowers in their hair and caftans and so on. It was another fold in the popular culture commodity fashion circuit. Okay. So they had photo shoots and were photographed meditating or sitting around, sort of just being photographed. Really, they're not meditating there, are they? They've got garlands around them, and they're looking very different to what the Beatles had been as in their initial incarnation as a kind of teddy boy rock and roll phenomenon. This, of course, was a part of a global popular culture move, of which, the times were changing. Bob Dylan was very effective from early in the 60s onwards. He was about to go electric, and the 1968 Democratic Convention was a hot political issue in America at the time, which had, of course, the musical soundtrack of anti-war protest songs, and which war, of course, there was the American War, or what they called the Vietnam War, American youth protesting on campuses against conscription, against the threat of being sent to war, and that was on the back of what had been a decade of protest, I suppose, in America and elsewhere. France, 68 was very important. 68 was crucial, of course. I don't need to tell you about what's happening in Vietnam at the time, but certainly worldwide, Mexico, Japan, Algeria, all sorts of places had a 60s youth rebellion. And that was on the back of what had begun earlier in the 60s with the civil rights movement, the anti-racist movement, led by people like here, Martin Luther King, getting arrested in 1963, part of the Freedom Ride movement and against segregation in the South of America, like nearly 100 years, almost 100 years after the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery. There was still incredible racism in the South of the US, across the US, of course, and not missing from other parts of the world. But Martin Luther King was certainly a figure in this. His famous "I Have a Dream" speech in the Washington Mall here, "I have a dream." That the intonation of that call and response has a musical, a sound, a sonic dimension that we could study as well. There are texts on this as well, and of course his commitment to anti-war, which in the end got him assassinated, got him killed. You can see here is leading a demonstration against war and against, obviously, the war in Vietnam. And that was a part of the background, the backdrop of the turn to Asia of the Beatles at the time. Now, the Beatles, of course, were doing pop. They were doing a cartoon show. They were making Yellow Submarine, these colourful videos, and all sorts of product that was, well, let's look at some. Martin Luther King was not the only one involved in the anti-war movement, but his assassination was a catalyst. He even anticipated his death and so on. He had been prophetic. He'd spoken against the Vietnam War not long before his assassination in the Riverside Church in New York. And that was a significant moment, but not only him, Malcolm X from the Nation of Islam. Originally, he left them eventually and was a leader, a previous teacher and a member of the Nation of Islam. He took the name of Malcolm X after he left the Nation of Islam, X referring to the surname, but he was certainly a major leader of the civil rights movement. But not only, right? Martin Luther King was quoting JFK, like JFK was assassinated as well in 1963. Like the leadership of the left of America is something to be considered. How that was pushed out by the FBI and reactionary forces. The JFK, John F. Kennedy, the president, and that was the part of the quote that Martin Luther King gives in he quotes JFK in that Riverside speech at the time that he was saying that the US needs to not be in Vietnam. We should also think at the time of the Black Panther Party, Bobby Searle and the Black Panther Party for self-defense stood up in America, and in America where it's legal to carry firearms. Black men carrying firearms was a provocation, legally acceptable under whichever amendment it is of the American Constitution, but it was a stance against racism. The Black Panthers did a lot of community organizing as well, especially in Oakland. They're famous for their breakfasts, and so you can read, and we can read and study that. Huey Newton and Bobby Searle here. The Black Panther Party were, of course, decimated by the FBI as well. And drugs like heroin was used to flood the inner cities where the Black community largely lived, and it was quite devastating. This is the other side of the commodity system. There was the brightly coloured Beatles, hippies, hate Ashbury, flower power side. There was a reaction that was deeply unpleasant, including confrontations over Vietnam. You see here in the middle of the photo, if it's not clear, this is someone burning their draft card so they don't have to be sent to fight the war in Vietnam. And that's significant. Students were shot on campuses. This is Kent State in America in 68. I think 1970, sorry, 4 were killed in a demonstration. Part of the growing anti-war movement by the early 70s, it became untenable for America to stay in that war where they were losing on the ground. Now, I want to think about the Beatles, though. That side of the Beatles that is colourful and bright is interesting because there's a few Vietnamese bands that think that the Beatles are great and follow them up, and we should listen to a little bit, or at least pay a bit of attention to the Chili's. They have a Beatles fascination. You can see here a famous photograph in the bottom of the Beatles later on walking across the pedestrian crossing at Abbey Road, was reproduced by the Chili's, and I thank some students for pointing this out. It's a great image, and it's the way in which popular culture circulates, I suppose, to make product. There's another band that loves the Beatles, Yacht Band. They like the melodic side of the Beatles, and they're what you'd call easy listening, okay? But that's not to be sniffed at. But let's say there's a question to be raised about which side of the 60s you market and remember, the Beatles or the Painted Black side, the darker Stones. And underneath all of that, let's see, I don't think either of those popular culture versions, the whole story is the bifurcation in Western culture of wanting to escape from a market mentality, but getting drawn back into it, making product, and the protest against the biggest part of the market, the marketing industry, which was the making of war, which is, after all, is a product thing. It's about selling. It's the arms trade. It's weapons, selling weapons, as well as politics, of course, but politically justified by massive investment in armaments. So what I think we need to think about, especially, is while the popular music side was very colourful, and the hippie side and the culture industry so it was very colourful. At the same time, the effect of that popular culture was a slow shift in popular support away from the military effort in Asia, in Vietnam. So there was some impact of this popular culture intervention, so that the reality of the war was coming home to Americans on their screen, and their kids were coming home dead, and it looked like that. Although subsequently popular culture turned it into something worse than this terrible, tragic scene of this guy draped in death and exhausted by the war, was reinvented in subsequent decades in popular culture, especially in movies that we should study, like Rambo, to make it also muscular and heroic, which we know damn well it wasn't. So that's what this course will be about. It'll be a study of how popular culture has a kind of dark side, has a light, colourful side, and a happy side, and has these effects. We will look at a number of different material, and here you can check out some of the references and the reading for next week, which is Madhava Prasad's The Economics of Ideology, Popular Film, Form, and the Mode of Production, because I'm going to introduce Hindi films and Indian and cinema, which is a lot of great fun. So join us for the next week. Thanks very much, and good luck.